How do severance and termination laws differ in Canada? Why at-will thinking causes problems? In the United States, at-will employment sits in the background of most HR decisions. Managers are used to the idea that barring discrimination or retaliation, they can end employment with little or no notice. When that mindset is brought into Canada, it clashes with the basic structure of Canadian law. In Canada, terminations without cause almost always require notice or pay in lieu. There is no broad at-will rule that lets employers sidestep that obligation just because they say so in a policy. US companies that forget this end up surprised by the cost and complexity of Canadian terminations. The statutory minimum layer. Each Canadian province has an employment standard statute that sets minimum notice or termination pay. Those minimums are tied mainly to length of service and sometimes to other factors such as size of the employer. For example, an employee who has worked a certain number of years will be entitled to a set number of weeks of notice or pay in lieu at minimum. In some jurisdictions, there is also statutory severance pay for longer-serving employees in larger organizations. These minimums are not negotiable. If a contract or handbook tries to promise less, that part is simply invalid. Contractual termination clauses. On top of statutory minimums, employers often use written termination clauses in employment agreements to define what happens if someone is let go without cause. A carefully drafted clause can limit the employee to a specific amount of notice or pay in lieu that is still at or above statutory minimums. If the clause is clear and compliant, courts will usually enforce it. If it is sloppy, contradicts employment standards, protections, or is badly worded, courts can strike it out. When that happens, the clause disappears and the employee can claim a higher level of notice based on judge-made rules. Common law reasonable notice. If there is no valid termination clause, Canadian courts fall back on the idea of reasonable notice. They look at factors such as the employee's age, length of service, position, and the availability of comparable work to decide how much time it should reasonably take for the person to find a similar job. That reasonable notice period is often significantly longer than the statutory minimum. It is not unusual for long-serving senior employees to receive months of notice or pay in lieu. That is why a simple last paycheck plus a small amount approach that might seem normal in some US settings is often inadequate in Canada. The narrower idea of cause. Firing for cause with no notice or pay in lieu is possible in Canada, but much narrower than many US managers assume. It usually requires serious misconduct, dishonesty, or other behavior that fundamentally breaks the employment relationship. Performance issues, attitude problems, or simple poor fit usually do not rise to that level unless the employer has built a careful record of warnings and support. And even then, it can be hard to meet the standard. If you call something cause in Canada but cannot prove it, you risk a wrongful dismissal claim where the court applies the full reasonable notice analysis. Benefits continuation and other pieces of the package. In many situations, notice or pay in lieu is not the only piece of a termination package. There can be expectations or obligations around continuing group benefits for part of the notice period, paying out accrued but unused vacation, and sometimes providing additional sums in exchange for a signed release. The exact mix depends on the contract, company practice, and the law in the province. For a US employer, this is another surprise. Termination is not just about salary. It is also about what happens to benefits and other entitlements during the transition. Process, documentation, and risk management. How you carry out a termination matters. Courts look at whether the process was respectful, whether information was clear, and whether the employee was given a chance to understand the terms before being pressured to sign anything. Heavy-handed tactics can backfire and increase risk. From a practical standpoint, foreign employers should treat Canadian terminations as structured events. That means preparing a written package, knowing the legal baseline, being ready to explain the numbers, and documenting the reasons without exaggeration. Planning and budgeting for exits. For a US company, the main takeaway is that Canadian severance and termination law turns exits into planned financial events, not casual decisions. When you hire, you should assume that letting someone go without cause in the future will cost more than a final paycheck. When you plan a restructuring or a shutdown of Canadian operations, termination costs need to be part of the model, just like lease penalties and contract wind-down expenses. If you ignore that reality, the numbers will catch up with you anyway. If you want to design Canadian employment contracts that give you predictability while respecting local law, you can explore more detailed guidance at www.theaccountingandtax.com. If you require assistance with Canadian tax matters, our team is ready to provide reliable professional support. Please contact us at 416-283-8774 or visit theaccountingandtax.com for more information. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.